Okay, good morning. Welcome to our session today on the Industrial Revolution. Um, we are now post our first essay. Hooray! Okay, we got our first essay done. We are now halfway into the semester as of this recording, right? That we are in week 8. That is the halfway point for our class. So awesome. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Industrial Revolution and then in the United States, how much that changes the economy, which that change in the United States economy, what's the term your textbook uses for that? Anybody know? It's very similar to Industrial Revolution, but not quite. Lavender's like, nope, don't remember that. Market revolution, the market revolution, right? Because it also changes the economic marketplace. So that's the difference between the two terms. The Industrial Revolution is referring to like the technological change, as we're going to talk about it too, a social change. The market revolution is specifically referring to the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the American economy. So your textbook likes to talk about market revolution a lot. So if you see that phrase, that's what the definition is. So we're talking about the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the American economy when we use the phrase market revolution. So I wanted to kind of focus on the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the average person living in the United States. So in other words, if you were living through the Industrial Revolution, what changes would you see in your life because of all of this new technology and invention that's happening? But if we're going to understand how it changes, we kind of have to backtrack a little bit and talk first about before all of this change happens. So we probably don't think about very much about things like how far do we travel every day or where our food comes from, right? We're pretty easy on that. But I mean, think about, for example, how far do we travel on average today from your house? I mean, like, for example, I know Mary is currently on her way back from Las Cruces, right? To El Paso. So that is a pretty significant mileage, right? Before the pandemic, I was commuting from Horizon to Canutillo every day to campus. So, you know, that's a pretty significant distance too. But our range, our geographic range as our daily life has greatly expanded because of the Industrial Revolution. Because think about it, what methods of transportation did you have, let's say late 1700s before the Industrial Revolution? How'd you get around? Any ideas?
On foot or like horseback?
Yep, foot or horseback, maybe carriages, but you probably would want roads for carriages to work really well, right? Otherwise, very bumpy ride. I mean, it's entirely possible to take a wheeled vehicle over a very rough terrain. It's not going to be comfortable ride. I have off-roaded a Hyundai, what was it, Rio, on an old sugarcane road in Kauai that had potholes as big as boulders. And I didn't wreck the car, but it wasn't a pleasant ride either. It's the only way I could get to the beach. You have to have a 4-wheel drive to be able to get to the beach in Kauai, or at least that's what they tell you. I didn't need one. So yeah, on foot, on horseback, carriages would be a little bit difficult again, depending upon roads. So that means you're probably not traveling very far on a daily basis, right? You're really not going as far as we normally do to commute to work or to school. How did you get the foods you eat? Today we go to the grocery store, right? Really easy down the road. How do you get the food that you're eating at this time period? You're probably having to do what? Grow it,
Like
right? You're probably having to grow it yourself. I mean, it's possible, especially if you live in a city during this time period, that you could just go to a general store, right? A merchant and buy food. But for the most part, especially if you're kind of living on the sort of edges or in small towns, you're probably growing a lot of the food that you eat, right? What we call subsistence farming, right? Growing to sort of sustain yourself. How do you get the clothes you wear and the tools you use? Again, we can kind of just go on the internet today, right? Like it's still Amazon Prime Day as of this recording, right? We can get stuff shipped directly to our home, but how are people getting stuff to wear or tools to use at this time?
Probably making a lot of it, and then if there's like small towns nearby, then trading for it.
Right, so either making it or trading for it. Yep. So clothing, for example, you could make homespun, especially like from wool, right? You can kind of use those old-fashioned spinning wheels, like you've probably seen like the movie Sleeping Beauty, right? That she pricks her finger on, stuff like that, right? So making your own clothes. So that probably means you don't have an extensive wardrobe, right? Maybe like 1 or 2 outfits per person. If you wanted to buy cloth, you could if you had a small town near you. Like cotton is growing in popularity in the late 1700s, cotton clothing. Tools, again, you make them, trade for them, like you said, if you're in a small town, or trade with your neighbors, right? So in other words, not as easy to get a hold of stuff. And because of that, you're probably more likely to try to do repairs on your own of the clothes and tools you have, right? Because it's very hard to find replacements. How did you work? What kinds of jobs do you think the average American has during this time period? Again, it's different depending upon whether you live in a city or town or if you're kind of out in the sticks, right? A lot of Americans are farmers at this time. So they're working on farms for themselves. In fact, that's going to be true until the late 1800s. We don't see a shift from the majority of population working on farms to the majority of populations working outside of agriculture until the late 1800s. So for the most part, the average American is still working on a farm, right? And what are your working hours if you work on a farm?
Basically all day.
Basically all day, right? You've got different chores at different times of day, maybe different things you do based on the season. So it's far more driven by time of year and daylight, right? What you're doing and how you're working. Okay. How do you communicate with other people that don't live with you? So again, we kind of have phones, right? We can shoot off quick text messages. How are you communicating with your friends during this time period?
You're not.
You're not, right?
Probably
Maybe
not.
you see them.
And I guess probably you could send letters long distance if you needed.
You could send letters long distance, right? Although how long it takes to get to them depends on, right? Again, transportation. Like we do have the post office is in existence at this time, right? But again, it's very difficult if your methods of transportation really are kind of like on foot, horseback, or on the water, right? So like boats. So it really is going to depend, right? So you can write to them, but I mean, you can't text them or call them or shoot them an email, right? None of that stuff exists yet. So communication is far slower before the Industrial Revolution. So basically, in a nutshell, your life is pretty small in terms of space and distance during this time period. If you're talking about participating in the economy, right? Like trading goods in a marketplace. Like I think it was Mary who said you're probably just trading goods with your neighbors at the local level, because trying to get plugged in elsewhere, especially if you live in a farm, is a little bit difficult. So just to give you an example, your textbook mentions that before the Industrial Revolution, it cost as much to ship something 30 miles over land as it did to ship it from the United States to the UK. So that's 30 miles is about my commute usually to work. So I mean that's pretty high, right? And water transportation is the fastest and the most reliable before the Industrial Revolution. So if you were trying to ship something from Cincinnati to New York, rather than try to ship it overland, it's far faster to ship it sort of down the Mississippi River, up the Gulf Coast, onto the Atlantic coast to get it there, than shipping it overland. Okay. So most people live a very sort of local lifestyle. They're eating locally, they're trading locally with their neighbors. If you lived near a body of water or in a city, you probably would have access to goods from farther away, but for most part, no. Okay. Living a very local lifestyle. Any questions so far? We don't have electricity, right? We're living by candlelight, by lamp. Okay. All right. So let's talk about what the Industrial Revolution is before we get into how it changes your life. So the Industrial Revolution does not begin in the United States. It begins in the late 1700s in Great Britain. Okay. part of the reason the Industrial Revolution starts in Great Britain is they have a couple of advantages. They have pretty big coal deposits that can be burned for energy, fairly close by to major population centers. They have cities with large populations, so they have workforce to sustain. And they also have, again, because they're a relatively small country, once they build a transportation network, it's really easy to transport things fairly quickly. So the thing you need to know about the Industrial Revolution is there are sort of three key developments that really push the Industrial Revolution. The first is the process of mechanization. What does it mean to mechanize something? Anybody know?
Would that be to like make it mechanically operate, or I don't know, be able to work alone without requiring someone to, I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're on the right track. Basically, mechanizing means a machine doing something a human had previously done by hand, right? So this is taking a machine and doing it. And what's the advantage of having a machine do something that a human would do by hand? What advantage does that give?
Oh, faster.
It is faster, correct. It's faster generally. I mean, the work quality might be different, but it is faster, right? So you can churn out goods faster by doing that. Then we also have kind of the second big advantage of the Industrial Revolution is the use of water and steam power. Previously, if you wanted to do something, you had to kind of put your own energy into it, right? Or maybe harness the energy of an animal, like pulling a sleigh or a plow, right, with a horse. Or in the case of my dogs, I think I could hook them up to a sled. And my smallest and most powerful one would do a great job just by herself on that. But yeah, so using human or animal power to kind of move things or get things going. Now we have the use of water power through like water wheels, right? You ever seen those on rivers near waterfalls, right? Harnessing the power of falling water. Or when we talk about steam power, burning a fuel like coal to generate steam, electricity. This enables the use of larger and larger machines, right? Because you have something else to power it that's not dependent just on human or animal energy. So water and steam power is really important for transportation and for machinery during the Industrial Revolution. And sort of the last kind of key piece of the Industrial Revolution is the use of iron and then later steel. What advantages do iron and steel have over wood for things like machines or equipment?
They are stronger and they last more.
They're stronger and they tend to last longer, especially if you take care of it, right? So iron and steel, their usage, because they last longer, it does tend to, make them more efficient machines than wood. Steel won't really be popularly used until 1856 when Henry Bessemer invents a process for refining steel. Before that point, steel is basically a refined version of iron. My dad's a metallurgical engineer, so I learned all of this stuff as a kid. Steel is a refined version of iron. It's lighter and harder and not as prone to rust as iron is, but it was very difficult to make on the large scale until Henry Bessemer's process. And so prior to the Bessemer process in the 1850s, iron is kind of the metal of choice. After the Bessemer process, steel becomes cheaper, more accessible, and then steel starts to overtake iron as the metal of choice. Okay. So these three things, using machines where previously humans had done the work, utilizing water and steam power rather than just human and animal power to power these new machines, and then using iron and steel, which were stronger, more durable materials. I can't talk today. These are all things that are key to the revolution as a whole. And these are all things that we're going to see applied to different advances in communication technology, transportation technology, and manufacturing technology. So one of the very first signs of the Industrial Revolution, of these sort of three key things being applied to an industry, is in textiles. So textiles is a fancy name for fabric, right? So in other words, the stuff that we wear, right, the towels that we use, stuff like that, fabric. So the earliest use of machines to do work that humans had done by hand come in the textile industry. Machines are invented to more quickly spin thread and to weave that thread into fabric or cloth. Now, early on, the first factories or centralized places of manufacturing come out of the textile industry specifically to make thread. The first factory in the United States is founded in 1790 in Pawtucket, Rhode Island by Samuel Slater. And that was a factory that made yarn. Slater had to be very careful because the British at this point really valued their copyrights, and they actually made it illegal to take plans for machines out of the country. So people like Samuel Slater, in order to establish factories outside of Great Britain, actually had to do things like memorize the specs for a machine so that they could recreate it and rebuild it in a new place, or to try to smuggle blueprints out of the country, because the British were very protective of their trade copyrights. Now, initially, when Slater establishes his factory, the idea is that the factory makes the yarn, but then they still outsource weaving the yarn into cloth at home. This is what we call the putting out system. We don't mean this as like, and today we think of putting out as, right, someone takes you on a date and they pay for your dinner and they hope for maybe like a kiss or something else, you know, at the end of the day. Not that kind of putting out. Okay. In this case, what putting out means is outsourcing labor to a workforce that's outside of your physical workspace. So in other words, outsourcing basically is what we would think of it here. So Slater's factory would send the completed yarn to people at home who would then be paid not by the time they worked, but by what they put out. Okay, so that's why it's called the putting out system. So you at home would get paid by the piece of clothing that you made, not necessarily by the time it took you to do it. So what that meant was for people in participating in the system, they could do it on their own time, right? You were sort of your own boss. You were just paid by what you eventually put out. So a lot of families kind of did this as a side gig to farming. Maybe you do this during the winter months, right, when there's not as much work to do on the farm. This is something that you can kind of do at your own pace and time. But once we also see mechanization of weaving machines like power looms, powered by steam, then we start to see those shift to factories as well. So in 1814, the first large-scale factory for producing woven cloth is built in Waltham, Massachusetts by a company called Boston Associates. The same company will establish a huge complex at Lowell, Massachusetts in the 1820s. The Lowell facility will centralize all aspects of textile production, from making the yarn to the woven cloth to even eventually articles of clothing on site. And by 1850, Lowell was a full-fledged town with 52 textile mills employing 10,000 workers. And what's interesting about all of these, Pawtucket, Waltham, and Lowell, where are they all? What region of the United States?
The North Coast?
They're north, right? Specifically New England. And part of the reason why these first factories are in New England is all of these towns, if you look them up on a map, you pulled up Google Mapping, you looked at all of them right now, they are all located along rivers and specifically fall lines. So they're taking advantage of water power, right, from these waterfalls. They're harnessing what we would today call, right, hydroelectric power to run these plants. So these first factories, because they're very dependent, especially on water power, that kind of dictates where you put them. You have to put them near a water source. Once steam engines become a little bit more popular, then you're not as restricted as to where you locate your factory, and you can move your factory closer to, say, a city where you have an existing workforce. The other thing that makes factories really central is not just only mechanization, but also standardizing production through the use of interchangeable parts. So the two Elis you have to thank for this are Eli Terry and Eli Whitney. Both of them realized around the same time and separately that if you standardize the parts for something, you could make the production of it cheaper and faster, and the repair of this a lot easier. So Eli Terry does this with clocks. Eli Whitney does this with firearms. So they realized that this would make it more inexpensive. Because previously, if you had, let's say, a musket or a rifle, which is starting to grow in popularity at this time, if you bought it, you'd probably buy it from somebody called a gunsmith who made it by hand. So if something broke on your gun, you'd have to take it back to the gunsmith and he'd have to custom make a part that fits your gun, right? Because it was handmade. With Eli Whitney and Eli Terry's idea, you have standardized parts so that way you can just easily swap it out. Okay. So the idea of interchangeable parts really grows the type of things you can mass manufacture. So we're moving away from just cloth and down to things like clocks and firearms being made in factories. And again, as I mentioned, New England becomes the manufacturing hub first because of the number of rivers and waterfalls that can harness water power, and then eventually because they have cities, right, that have a better supply of workers that factories can locate to. So now, rather than making stuff on our own, we can now buy stuff, right? But it's one thing for them to manufacture stuff. They still have to get it to the consumer, right? We still have that transportation barrier. So this is where we have advances in transportation really helping to transport these goods from the places that they're manufactured to consumers. So for example, the use of the steam engine in boating. Robert Fulton pioneers this with his steamboat Clermont in 1807, testing it in the Hudson River in New York. What advantage does the steam engine have over ships powered by sails? Traditionally was the way that people boated. What advantage does a steam engine powered boat have over a sail powered boat?
You don't like have to wait for the wind. You can just go whenever.
Right. You don't have to wait for the wind. You don't have to be dependent upon the current of water. So this enables you to move more quickly and to not have to wait for Mother Nature to cooperate with you, right? So you can go upstream, like for example, upriver, using these things. So that's one of the reasons why this technology spreads very quickly. By 1811, we see steamboats already in the Mississippi River, going up and down river. Now, if you're going to take full advantage of this new steamboat technology, it also helps to, again, have accessible bodies of water. So states start digging canals to connect lakes and rivers. The biggest, by far, canal project that was built during this time period is the Erie Canal, which is 363 miles long. It's still in use today. And it connects the Great Lakes region with New York City. Okay, by plugging in. So we have cities today like Buffalo and Rochester, New York, and upstate New York that exist because this canal is there, right? Because this is now on a trading network. State governments take the lead in building this stuff because we still have a concern over what's the proper role of the national government. And so some people said, well, it's not really the national government's job to finance these kinds of construction projects like the Erie Canal. That seems to be a state deal. So before the Civil War, the federal government spends about $60 million in infrastructure like canal building or railroads, but the states collectively spend 10 times that amount. So most of this kind of infrastructure investment is coming from the state governments before the Civil War. Today, we'd probably consider that more along the lines of, we tend to think of the federal government, right, bankrolling a lot of infrastructure today. Now, in addition to canals enabling water transportation, we also have trying to improve overland transportation, right? Because bodies of water don't exist everywhere for us to tap into and take advantage. So we do have some attempts at road buildings, particularly turnpikes, which are toll roads, right? Why would you charge somebody to drive on a road? What's the logic there? We don't have very many of these in El Paso yet.
Pay for the building of the road? And
to pay for the building of the road, and then once that's paid off, the maintenance of the road, right? So the logic of a toll road is it doesn't take as much sort of investment long term because it'll eventually pay for itself. Now, there's a reason we don't have very many of these in El Paso, and why is that? Why don't people like toll roads?
because they're cheap, so they'll just use the roads that are not tolled.
People are cheap, right? They don't want to have to pay tolls. So this is part of the reason why we also see the existence of shunpikes, which are meant to be shortcuts around toll booths. So you can still use the road without having to pay the toll. So local governments will construct these too. The problem is, though, is that roads are very expensive to build, and they're very expensive to maintain. The state of Texas, in fact, has discovered this in recent years and has taken the steps in some areas to actually depave some roads for easier maintenance. So this is definitely always a challenge. This is part of the reason why railroads really take off in popularity over building roadways. So railroads are made possible because of iron and steel, because of the steam engine. And the growth of railroads will help to grow the iron and steel industry and also coal mining for fuel. So railroads, the advantage they have over roads is that while they're still expensive to build, they're far easier to maintain than regular roadways. You can build them anywhere, right, along with enough ingenuity. And so railroads start to connect more rural markets with urban cities. And it helps to expand the frontier by making it faster to transport people and goods. The very first railroads in the United States are the Baltimore and Ohio in 1828 and the South Carolina Canal and Railroad in 1833. Most of the railroad construction before the Civil War is done by individual companies. By 1860, the United States has about 30,000 miles of railroad across the United States, which is more than the rest of the world combined during this time period. So we went crazy for railroads. Now, let me see if I can zoom in on this map. So let's look at this map a little bit more closely. Zoom, zoom, zoom. All right. So this is a map of all railroads in the United States by 1860. What do you notice looking at this map? What are some things that stand out to you?
There's way more railroads in the north.
Way more railroads in the north. Why do you think that is?
Because the factories are in the north.
Factories in the north, right? A lot of populations in the north. Okay, what else? How far does the network go?
Not very far west, but
Not
still
very far west, right? Missouri, right, is kind of the terminus of the connection. Now, there are isolated bits of railroad, right? You can see there's a little tiny sliver in southeast Texas, around where Houston is today. You can see there's an itty-bitty little one in California, but they're not plugged in, right? And part of the reason for the railroad network not being even more powerful before the Civil War is, remember how I said individual companies build them? There's no standard width for the railroads, what we call gauge, in between wheels. Remember, those wheels are fixed on those cars, right? So what this meant is you couldn't seamlessly travel along this whole rail network that you see here, despite the fact that it looks connected. You would have to switch cars every time you switched to a different railroad because they had a different width. So you couldn't have one train car sort of smoothly. That's going to be fixed after the Civil War. But for right now, there's no standard, so transportation is not as smooth as it might look in these regions. All right. So the railroad is a huge, huge technology. It's going to even more explode after the Civil War. But for right now, the area that's the most kind of plugged into the railroad network is the Northeast. All right. So how could you communicate with your friend over long distance? We said letters, right, which depend on the post office being able to transport. But there's also this new technology called the telegraph. So Samuel Morse invents the telegraph in the 1830s, and the telegraph can transmit messages nearly instantaneously over a system of wires across great distances. So Samuel Morse invented this in the 1830s, and by 1844, it's being very heavily used commercially. Why aren't average people using telegraphs? Like, why don't we have telegraphs in every house like we would have telephones eventually?
I assume they're pretty expensive.
They're pretty expensive, yes. And then there's one other barrier to using a telegraph.
Probably the wiring didn't really go to individual homes very much because people live pretty spread out.
Yeah, they live pretty spread out, right? So wiring's not there. And there's one other thing you need to know to use a telegraph.
Morse code?
Morse code, right? You need to know Morse code. How many of you guys know Morse code? None of us, right? So Morse code is a system of dots and dashes that you use to communicate these messages. And because of the cost, right, the infrastructure, as you guys mentioned, because of this barrier, right, needing to know this specialized language, this is why telegraphs don't take off as residential pieces of equipment. So if you wanted to send and receive telegraphs, you'd have to go to a town, to their local office, right? And you'd have to give your message to sort of be translated and transmitted, and then wait for a message back, and again, kind of had to be translated and written down. So the telegraph is super important, but it's mostly going to be used by businesses and by the government, not by individuals, unless, again, you were communicating with somebody who was close by one of these telegraph offices. And much like railroads, telegraphs become super popular. By 1860, we have about 50,000 miles of telegraph. Okay. So what this ends up doing is this ends up standardizing prices in different places of the nation, because you can kind of communicate about supply and demand across distances, and it helps to speed up communication, particularly things like reporting, as we're going to see during the Civil War, right? We can have dispatches almost real time from battle lines back home to the home front. So the market revolution, what we call the expansion of the economy due to the Industrial Revolution, really impacts different regions of the United States. And I'm just going to kind of go over this just slightly because your textbook goes into far more detail. In the West, we're going to have increased settlement and expansion into the West. Again, railroads make it far easier for people to get out west to settle and also to ship their goods back east to urban marketplaces. In the South, we're going to see the rise of commercial scale agriculture, particularly what crop becomes big business in the South?
Is it cotton?
It is cotton, right? We move on from tobacco. Cotton becomes a hot commodity. Again, this demand for cotton clothing because it's lighter than wool. You can do lots of cool patterns with it. This demand for cotton by factories in the North and by consumers is going to drive the growth of cotton in the South. And we're going to revisit that topic in a few weeks. In the North, we're going to see the continued growth of manufacturing, of factories, as well as the growth of cities that are plugged into this trade and transportation network. So mechanization expands outside the factory and into agriculture, which actually also helps to explain the growth of commercial scale agriculture. In the South, for cotton, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793, which sped up the processing of cotton, really enables the explosive growth of the cotton economy in the South. In the North and the West, the embrace of machines for agriculture, including the mechanical reaper invented by Cyrus McCormick in 1831 and John Deere's steel plow in 1837, enable harvesting excuse me, and field preparation on a far greater scale. And when it comes to settling the West, the area that we call kind of the prairie of the West, really is only possible to farm with the use of the steel plow, because otherwise the land and the native grasses are very hard. It's very difficult to get into the ground without a steel plow. So from 1840 to 1860, wheat production triples in the United States because of the invention of things like the mechanical reaper and the steel plow. Cotton cultivation in the South goes from 5 million pounds a year in 1793 to 170 million a year in 1820. Okay, so this mechanization really does help agriculture as well. Cities start to become known as centers of trade, not only for locations of factories, but again, being connected into this transportation and communication network. The number of cities that had 5,000 or more people, which to us sounds small right now, right? We live in a city of like 650,000 people. 5,000 people sounds quaint, right? By then, though, that was considered a city, and those grow in number. By 1850, we have 150 cities of 5,000 people or more. And one of these cities that experiences explosive growth is Chicago. If you look at the picture on this slide, this is a map of little old Chicago in the 1830s. Look how small it is. Chicago was a tiny town in the 1830s, but thanks to being connected into the railroad, Chicago will become the 4th largest city in the United States by the early 1860s. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution really enables the growth of towns. Now, as I mentioned, the Industrial Revolution changes your life and the life of average Americans in ways that you probably don't even think about. For example, the way we keep track of time. Like we mentioned at the beginning of today's class, most Americans working as farmers kind of have their jobs dictated by the rhythm of the seasons, by the amount of sunlight. But now the clock becomes more important. Why do you think the clock overtakes Mother Nature as recording time?
Partly because of the railroad.
Partly because of the railroad, right? Because if you need to have sort of standardized time, right, in order to sort of set arrivals and departures for railroads. In fact, railroads are going to, after the Civil War, adopt what we know today as our sort of standard time zones to try to prevent things like horrific crashes. So yes, the railroad is one reason. Factory workers, right? So Thomas gives the other reason. Now people are being paid not by the amount of work they do, but by the amount of time they work. So paying people by the hour now means that you're much more reliant on the clock, right? Your shift starts at a certain time, right? That you guys are tuning into this class at 10 a.m., right? Not when the sun is at this position in the sky. Okay, so specific times and having to keep track of specific times. This is partly due to the workplace as well as the railroad. Okay. There's also a more distinct separation of your work and leisure time, right? The idea that you're working, say, a 9 to 5 shift, although people at this time period would be working far more than that. Today we have standard 8-hour work days. In this time period, your work shift was closer to 12 to 16 hours a day. Okay. So this notion of you're at work for certain times, and then when you're not at work, you're off, right? You can do whatever you want, probably sleeping a lot if you're working 16-hour shifts. This is very different because, again, kind of on the farm, if you're doing work, you could kind of socialize, right? Like a barn raising, building a barn becomes kind of a community event and a party, or sort of like repairing clothing, a knitting circle, right? Becomes sort of a social event. So you kind of mix leisure and work together. Here now they're more separate, right? Although for us working at home or taking classes at home during the middle of a pandemic, it doesn't feel like they're very separate, does it? Yeah, this is something that definitely is a little bit more challenging for modern working from home. And then the concept of wages, that you're getting paid by the time you work and not by the amount of work you put in, is also weird and different. Previously, if you were an artisan and you made something like a gun or a saddle or something like that, you were paid a price that was kind of pinned to how much time and effort you put into something, right? Now, however, workers are again paid by the hour or by the day. Okay, so this separation, right, of value is there. Now, even though, as I mentioned, the majority of Americans are still farmers until the late 1800s, more and more Americans are working in factories. And this brings up a question: is factory work a violation of American freedom. Because if you think about it, you're now having to work at a specific time, right? Dictated by the clock. You're getting told how to do your job, right? And closely supervised by a new class of workers called managers. And very often they specifically told workers like when they could take breaks, if they could take breaks, right? And how to work. Your textbook in this chapter has a document from a factory worker in Lowell talking about how she felt that these women working in these textile mills at Lowell were like slaves. Like they weren't given enough time to like take a bathroom break or eat lunch or other kinds of things, right? That they were constantly being told what to do. And so because of this perception as factory work, as being sort of unfree, a lot of white dudes didn't want to do it. So Thomas asked, they applied, so they chose that life. Yes and no. So with the example with Lowell is yes, that they applied. But for many of these young women, this is really their only option other than staying at home. So if women wanted to work wages outside of the home, if they wanted to earn money outside of the home, for these young women, that was realistically their only option at this point in time. Lowell also made it a habit to recruit sort of rural farm girls from Massachusetts and sort of persuade their parents that it was a good gig because not only would these women get paid, but they would also live in dormitories on site in the factories. They would sort of have to attend church service and leisure activities. So for these young women, like it's a choice, but it's a very limited choice. They don't have a whole lot of options. And then they find themselves not only being micromanaged at work, but also in their off time. Because the company realized that what is the big concern that these parents probably had about sending off their young unmarried daughters? Think like your mom and dad. What concern do they have? You going off all alone to the big town, making money of your own.
I guess them just making bad choices and like running away and
bad choices,
bad
right?
life.
Yeah, making bad choices, getting into trouble, chasing after boys, right? Maybe getting knocked up out of wedlock. You don't want that to happen, right? So the company is kind of trying to tell the parents that they're going to be the parent in the absence, right? That they're going to make sure the girls don't get in trouble. And so while these girls kind of chose this, again, there's not a whole lot of choice on their part. And so Lowell, for the first several decades, most of their workers are going to be these unmarried women from farming families who work there for a few years and then kind of go back home and get married, right, and resume their farming life. So as I mentioned, females tend to be the workforce for a lot of these factories because a lot of white men didn't want to do this. They didn't want to spend their time being told what to do. And factories like Lowell really liked using women because they could pay them less. Right, so the wage gap that we talk about, women getting paid less than men for the same job, starts during this time period and still persists today, even though the gap is closing as the decades go on. Apparently, Joy has thoughts about that. She says, it's not fair, my mom gets paid less. All right. During this time period, as I mentioned, kind of women don't see this as a permanent gig. This is a sort of temporary stopping point. Then we also have the use of kids, child workers. So again, companies, there's no child labor laws at this time. So companies are like, hey, we can use kids. Great. We can pay them even less than women because they're small humans. And I know this might shock some of y'all because we have very strict laws about child labor today, right? Apparently my dogs have thoughts about that too. Child labor at this time, childhood as we think of it today, as a time where kids are supposed to sort of explore and learn and have downtime, doesn't really exist until the late 1800s. Children are just seen as mini adults during this time period. So if your family needed income to survive, to put food on the table, keep a roof over your head, yeah, you'd send those kids off to work. Kids are oftentimes used in factory jobs where their size was an asset to them. So things like repairing machines, which resulted in a lot of accidents. Lots of kids getting sort of maimed or killed on the job. And at this time, we do not have workers' compensation if you get hurt on the job. There's no life insurance. There's no medical insurance. There's no workplace safety laws. There's no minimum wage laws. No laws about the number of hours that you can work. No unemployment relief. None of that. None of that exists at this time. We also see immigrant workers coming in, again, with the logic the companies have that they're more pliable workers compared to men, because there's some jobs that women and kids can't do, especially in iron production, like foundry workers. They're like, oh yeah, women and kids aren't big or strong enough to do that. We do need men, and so they start recruiting immigrant men. Okay. And immigrant labor is far more accessible after the 1840s. I thought we'd have enough time to talk about more immigration today, but we don't. We're already after our appointed class time. So I'm going to go ahead and end there. Let me stop recording.